Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth edition of the Ones Who Don't Say They Love You online community book discussion. I'm Megan. I'm the executive director of One Book, One New Orleans. Joining me is Benjamin Morris, who will facilitate the conversation today. And we're a small but mighty group of three with Maureen O'Dwyer here, otherwise known as Zoom user. Take it away, Ben.
Hey, well, guys, thank y'all so much for having me in to talk about one of my absolute favorite collections of short stories. I'm going to put the hardback edition up in front of this little camera screen so everybody can see. It is, I mean, we all know this is a book that is just so full of heart. You know, these stories, they are funny and they are tragic and they are crazy wild in some cases, and they are just full of perseverance and dignity and grit and glory and just heart, heart, heart from the first page to the last. And it is impossible to put the book down once you have started reading it. It is, I mean, you wouldn't think of a book of short stories as a page turner, but I mean, time to change your concepts, right? Because this one is it. This one is absolutely it. You know, I have some thoughts, kind of some big picture thoughts for us to chew on a little bit. There are some aspects of the craft that I would love to kind of dive into, and I've got some questions for all of us here as we look at those big picture elements. And then I thought it would be nice to take a look at two stories in particular, which have some kind of really enigmatic and I think pregnant parallels between them that are just useful to kind of look at side by side. And as I like to do, I thought that before anything else, we would open with a poem, which to my mind is just such a grounds setter for Maurice's book. This poem, when I first read it 25 years ago, immediately became a you know, it's one that just lodges deep within you. You carry it around for the rest of your days, and it becomes, you know, a lamppost. It becomes a guiding light. It becomes a reminder. And this, I'm sure some folks out there in TV land will know the poem by Lucille Clifton called "Study the Masters." Study the Masters. Like my Aunt Timmy, it was her iron or one like hers that smoothed the sheets the master poet slept on. Home or hotel, what matters is he lay himself down on her handiwork and dreamed. She dreamed too. Words. Some Cherokee, some Maasai, and some huge and particular as hope. If you had heard her chanting as she ironed, you would understand form and line and discipline and order and America. You know, I think about that poem and I think about the forms of attention to which it calls us. That incredible silence at the end where we realize that we have gone from one microcosm of an image, a single ironing sheets, all the way up to the grandest, largest assessment and critique of this country in which we live with all its injustices. And the journey that that takes us on, the effect of that silence at the end, every single story in Maurice's book, I believe, has that exact same effect on us and requires us to pay attention to the Aunt Timmys of this world that are smoothing the sheets the master poet slept on. And if you don't believe me, all you have to do is read that story, Election, right there, smack in the middle. And that tells you everything you need to know. So we'll come back to Lucille maybe at the very end. Um, but for now, uh, respect to her, respect to her. For now, I thought it would be nice to look at three kind of big picture elements for short stories in general, and then we'll turn over to those two in particular stories, which are Beg, Borrow, Steal, and Fast Hands, Fast Feet. The big three, as I like to call them, and you guys have heard this before, I know you have, are setting, character, and plot. All right. And we've all had undergrad seminars, English major classes, high school classes where, we read a story and it's like, okay, let's talk about setting. Okay, let's talk about plot. But, one of the things that Maurice does so well in this book is he intertwines all of those in just really compelling ways. So we're going to pick apart those strands and then we're going to weave them back together again at the end. But let's talk about setting here to begin with, because of course, what is the setting for this book but a place we all know and love for all its ups and for all its downs, for all of its Tuesdays and for all of its Mardi Gras Tuesdays. We have this glorious, crazy, wonderful, broken, hopeful, joyful city of New Orleans. And, I was listening to one of the previous discussions, community discussions that One Book did back in the spring. And one of the participants there made the point, which I know has come up several times in this particular text, that the city of New Orleans is not just the place in which these stories are set and in which the characters kind of live and move and walk around and get into trouble and so forth. City of New Orleans is itself a character here, right? And what I wanted to do is I wanted to just ask you guys, right, kind of up front, um, what does that observation mean for y'all, for the city to be portrayed as this kind of secondary shadow background character that kind of takes on life in the same way that the living, breathing, two-legged critters walking around in it, the way that they do?
What really strikes me about this particular book and its use of New Orleans, I mean, a lot of books will concentrate on one area of the city,
Mm,
but this one in particular is all over the place, right? I'm actually looking right now for a list I made of every time he references a specific place in New Orleans.
mm,
And,
mm,
they
mm.
go from Carrollton to Duncan Plaza to the Magnolia Stables to the Mississippi River Bridge to the Claiborne Avenue overpass. And it's so incredibly large and rich that for me, it's sort of like the book itself sort of shows you sort of the depth and breadth of who we are, I actually just found it. I'll throw the list of all the places. Oh, your message is too long. Send multiple short messages. That's what the chat is.
Oh, it's that many places in the book that
It's
it won't even
that
fit.
many places that we can't even fit them all into one chat. I'm going to try this
Totally,
again.
totally.
But yeah, the depth and breadth of our city is really reflected in the depth and breadth of places mentioned. There's half of it. I'm about to paste the other half.
All right, let's see it. Oh yeah, the Broad Street overpass. That's a good one. Absolutely. That's from what, Mercury Forges, I believe.
That's Mercury Forges. Yeah, same one as Humanity Street
That's right.
and Good Children Street. That's also in that one. Oh wait, no, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Good Children's in Cesar Pittman.
Of course, of
Yeah,
course. As well as yeah, right, the
mhm.
Bailey and the area by the cathedral. Yeah.
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
We're probably about to be joined by the lady of my house, the four-legged mistress who has lots of opinions about Maurice's book and is actually quite good at sitting on it. So Snickers
Mhm.
will be joining the chat here in just a second. No, it's true, and I think your point, Megan, is excellent. That this book travels all over New Orleans, and I think it raises the really interesting question of how, as readers, does that begin to expand or develop or deepen our geography of the city, right? It's like suddenly we start to travel to places that we might never have been.
Mhm.
Suddenly, our understanding of the places that we know well begins to shift and begins to either deepen or to fracture, right? If we're seeing it through a
Mhm.
set of eyes that we're not, accustomed to inhabiting. So did you get that experience when you were reading that? You're sort of you're maybe you're my brother's, for instance, lives in Carrollton, and so in Big Bar Steel, when um, you know, uh, Tim and Timmy go to Broadway to Fraternity Row, and he's making up
Mhm.
sort of, names for the Greek characters on the buildings and so forth. I'm kind of thinking, well, that's the way that I take to get to my brother's house, up by Claiborne. And yeah, if you don't know those letters, I mean, they might as well be Martian symbols, like let's
Mhm.
make something up. They got to mean something, so let's make it up ourselves. Did you ever get that feeling?
A little bit. For me, it wasn't so much that with place, but it was how many times have I been blind to what is right in front of my eyes?
Hmm.
So one of the stories that you mentioned that we want to get into a little bit later was Fast Hands, Fast Feet. Maureen, because you said you might not be as familiar. Fast Hands, Fast Feet is told from the point of view of someone who's actually living under the Claiborne Bridge.
Hmm.
And, how many times have I driven by those folks and never thought about their stories? I'm very guilty of that. And the book made me aware of how many times I've driven by those folks and not thought about their stories. And how many voices in New Orleans, never really get heard and whose stories never really get valued. And so for me, that was kind of the eye-opening part, was not so much how I'm driving around, but who I do and do not pay attention to when I'm navigating this place. Does that make sense?
No,
Right.
definitely. I know, I have to say that because I am older, that I am concerned about the people under the bridge and do
Mm-hmm.
think about them, as I pass, because first of all, we see so many. And, I have so many friends who will say, I don't know why they're living there. I don't understand why they're there. And I try to explain that personally, I don't think anyone is there by choice. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe many are there by choice.
Mm-hmm.
Some may be, but for the most part, it's because they have other problems in their lives. And this is all that is left to their life. And I'm always, it's awful that it's hard for me to drive by, because I
Mm-hmm.
think of the hardships that these people are going through and not getting help. And then
Mm-hmm.
hearing people say, I don't know why they're under there, and no, I'm always conscious of that. But
Mm-hmm.
when you get old, you kind of think about things like
Well, it's a really good question and a really good point, kind of wrapped into one. I can tell you this, my church actually goes under the bridge fairly frequently to try to
that.
hand out supplies. And, if there are groups of women, we got kind of like packs of, feminine supplies that we'll give to
Yes.
them, and, for folks who need that sort of thing. And, we try to talk to them and just kind of get a sense of their story. I think you're absolutely correct in that many, not all, but many of them are not there by choice. There are smaller communities down by Chapatulas near the Convention Center Boulevard, and further down the bridge, closer to the river, where you do have folks who have kind of made little tent cities, and that is kind of their semi-permanent, settlement, because
Mhm.
they have found a community there. And some folks, we have heard by their own admission, they just say they don't do well under four walls and a roof. That it's just, they feel imprisoned. They don't like rules. The shelters have too many, folks who try to steal things or do worse, of course, as the character in Fast Hands, Fast Feet alludes to, is that folks will try to take more than just your stuff from you, in those particular environments. And so it's a combination of factors, one of which, though, I think is really interesting because it does pertain to the plot aspect we'll talk about in a little bit, which is that sense of being on your feet, being transient by necessity, but the necessity also propelling you past where your feet will take you at any given moment, right? And so if you think about the way that need and necessity drive so many of Maurice's characters, right? It helps you to understand that sense of uh, what what can bring a person to a particular place for a particular time and then send them on their way again, right? The bridge is kind of like the underpass is kind of like a snapshot of learning to ask that question. Terrible mixed metaphor, but so that we can then respond effectively to what does a single individual need in a single moment. And what our church community has found, going out and trying to minister to these folks, is sometimes they need really specific things. Sometimes they need an ID because they lost theirs and they don't know where to go to get just a state issued ID replacement so that they can start applying for stuff. In many cases, they're not from New Orleans. They're trying to get out of New Orleans, and they do need just transport, from one city to the next. They kind of got caught here, right? We've met tradesmen with sort of full credentials in their fields, electricians and, like cable installers and that sort of stuff, who just got evicted, within a matter of days. Previously, this is really common during COVID. And, they're just there for a minute while they're trying to get back on their feet, since they have skills that can employ them. So you get a wide variety of stories, but one of Maurice's insights, of course, in that particular story, which I think helps us to read that area with a little bit more skill and compassion both, is that it's nobody's home, right? It really is supposed to be nobody's home. And even the folks who live there know that. So the interesting thing happens when you start to see folks who have had to make it a home because they have no other options. And now you're on to kind of a different segment of that particular population. But I appreciate your considering those communities and those folks there, because if I were to tie both the angle of us as citizens and the angle of us as readers together, there is a constant tension between the invisible and the visible, right? For most folks in the city, those people who live under the bridge are invisible, and it would be better if they stayed invisible, right?
Right.
For empathetic readers, for those who try to go out and help those folks, you are always trying to make the invisible visible. You're trying to see these people, to hear their stories, to respond in some way. And it's a considerable challenge, but it's one of the most important challenges that we can undertake.
And sort of bouncing back to that, I've heard Maurice say more than once that in this book, he was trying to get on the page folks who he'd never seen on a page before, right? So really getting the stories of folks who previously may have been invisible in, literature itself. We're going to make those folks visible and present and real, and we're going to hear from them finally.
Well, Megan, you just actually answered ahead of time one of my second major questions for, the question of setting in place, which is beautifully done. Chapeau, as the French would say, chapeau. But, how does reading Maurice deepen our relationship to the city, specifically in terms of giving us a new set of eyes, wherever we go, right? And I think that what you just described is absolutely one of the results of reading The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You. You have no choice but to start to see people differently, see encounters differently, open your mind, open the eyes of your heart, as they say, to what that can possibly entail. Can you think of maybe a specific example that you've had, over the course of, the past year, as you've really spent time with this book, where you've, kind of like there's a little light bulb moment, or like a dimmer switch went slowly up, and suddenly you saw something differently or engaged a part of the city differently?
Oh, I'm trying to think. That's a really interesting question.
I'll give you mine if you want to stew on it
Yeah, give me yours while I
while I
think for a
share.
second.
You got it. You got it. So this is kind of a fun one. When I first got back to town after some years away, I had a nice new degree, but I couldn't get a job. with that degree. There were no jobs in teaching and research and with what I wanted to do. So I had to get a job bartending. You know, they say you haven't lived in New Orleans until you've had one of two things happen. Your bike's stolen or you've worked in the service industry. Okay. And I ticked both off the list pretty quick after I moved back to town. Well, I used to work at the Delachaise over on Louisiana and St. Charles.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
neat little spot, you know, fun little place to work. Well, if you've ever had a drink there, then you know there's a guy who, older gentleman, African American, who likes to play the saxophone out on the streetcar tracks. Okay. Late at night, usually rolls up about 10 p.m., sometimes 9-ish, but 10 p.m. is kind of usually his start time. And his name is Mike. We at the bar we always called him Sax Mike, and he was fine with that. Okay. Well, Mike was graduate of McDonough 35, and he was a proud graduate of McDonough 35. And when I was bartending, he would come around, and of course I'd just if I was closing up that night, of course I'd throw him a beer. You know, it's hot work. You know, he's out there making music and plays saxophone better than I ever will. You know what I mean? And you know, of course I'm gonna throw him a Bud Light or something like that. You know, as we're all kind of winded down for the evening. You know, it was a funny thing with Mike because legally he wasn't allowed on the property of the bar. You know, and the owner would always kind of like say shoo him off and say like you can't bother the patrons like
Mhm.
on the actual property. Like you can play on the streetcar line, you know, in the neutral ground. You can play across the street, you know, that's fine. And eventually there was this kind of like detente, right? It was kind of like a little cat and mouse, you know, kind of thing. Anyway, as I was reading Maurice, the moment where, you know, I realized, you know, he's seeing these folks that we would otherwise just kind of, you know, glaze over maybe a little bit or just kind of like dismiss as kind of a you know okay that's there they go again kind of thing. You know, it's at the very end of Before I Let
Mhm.
Go, right? And here you have the guy out under the streetlight who is supposed to be a stereotype and often is a stereotype, the old jazz man under the streetlight. Well,
Mhm.
in Before I Let Go, you know, the very last story, the longest story in the book, you know, Galia's out there listening to him play, and she knows him because they went to school together, right? And she sees him, and she actually has to defend his right to be there because he is a part of the musical fabric of the neighborhood, helping these young kids come up, you know, learning how to play, how to get ready for Mardi Gras, for the parades, and
Mhm.
so forth. And you know, I just really appreciated him doing that because, you know, if I had never worked side by side, you know, effectively, you know, with Sax Mike at that particular, you know, bar, you know, like night after night, he'd come by, you know, we'd chat a little bit and this, I'd throw him the beer, you know, that sort of thing, you know, like just constantly in each other's orbit. And I was understanding what he was, you know, trying to contribute. Just that, it was like Tesseract. It was like two moments in time kind of came together, you know, when I read,
Mhm.
that's 10 years ago that I was working at that job. But reading Maurice's story took me straight back there. And you know, his talent as a short story writer is to see, you know, the unseen, to kind of bring life and voice to those folks and afford them the dignity that they absolutely deserve, you know, just from the get-go.
Mhm.
So there's mine. That's my moment, you know, of
Got it. Got it.
okay,
So
so what you
Maureen, just a
got? What you
quick
got?
summary because you know you may not know the scene, but long story short, there's this dude who's playing the trumpet outside, right? In that short story. And he's one of Galia's neighbors. Galia is the main character. And her neighborhood is rapidly gentrifying. The Black residents are leaving. They're being replaced by younger, whiter residents with more money. And she goes to the new neighborhood association meeting, and they're talking about I think it's noise pollution
Yeah, oh
that
Oh,
yeah,
he's causing. And she's the one who's got to say, no, 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 he's a music teacher. You know, everything you love
yes,
about New Orleans is because of folks like him. So that's what Ben's referring to in that
yeah.
scene. Mine, actually, while you were talking, and I told this story once before. Can't remember if I've told it on camera or not.
sure.
Long story short, on April 21st of this year, my car got stolen.
Hmm.
And I
Oh,
was really ticked off for a couple weeks, you know, just
oh,
it's a nuisance. I got it back, you know, and the officer who got my car back also caught the folks on camera, and he said they were about 14, 15 years old.
Oh,
Right. So I was still ticked off, and then I reread Beg, Borrow, Steal. And it was the
Mhm.
first time that there's, long story short, and I'm not giving anything away, a series of events leads a minor to make a choice to steal a car. That's all I'll say about that.
Make a choice.
Right?
Yeah.
And it was really the first time I thought critically about like what might have led the folks who made the choice to steal my car to that point. And, it really moved me from anger to empathy, which is, I think, what a good book does, what a good writer can do is, touch your heart when previously your heart had been locked away. And he did that for me. So thank you, Maurice.
Yeah.
it was very interesting.
Snap, snap, right? There it is. There it
Yeah.
is. And I think that actually leads really nicely into the second kind of big picture concept for these stories, which is just so important to talk about, which is character. Like, who are these people, right? The ones that he's writing about. And one of the great strengths of Maurice's book is that, just like you were saying, with the wide variety of places that he takes us to, and the kind of your list of the different New Orleans local geographies. Do you remember when Nathaniel Rich published King Zeno, and
Mhm.
the middle section of King Zeno, which is set in 1917 New Orleans, is called Towns Within Towns, right? And you always get that sense of like, you can travel across this city and you can visit 100 different New Orleanses in 100 different days, depending on who you're
Mhm.
alongside and whose eyes you're seeing it through. It's the same kind of principle here. It's like Maurice gives us characters from all walks of life. I mean, we have, the rich white uptown lady in her tank-like SUV, right? And then we've
Mhm.
got, this 14-year-old kid who's just trying to survive and trying to do right by his family, by making that particular choice, right? Trying to
Mhm.
rescue his family from desperation by making that
Mhm.
particular choice. And you got everybody in between. I mean, you got everybody in between. And it's, every story you meet someone new and compelling and with such a distinctive voice. I think it's really important to recognize right up front when we talk about character in this particular collection that this book, and it's no secret, I'm not trying to reinvent any wheels here, it takes a strong stand against the great man or great person theory of
Mhm.
history, right? I mean, it just shoots that with double barreled, like buckshot right up front, and says, this is not how we're going to, proceed. What we are going to do is we're going to remember the forgotten. We're going to see the
Mhm.
unseen. We are going to, overcome. We're going to let these scales fall from our eyes, and we're going to basically, the way that I was thinking about as I was rereading, the stories is he is writing about folks who not only are not written about, but who, further than that, hardly ever get to tell their own stories themselves. You know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Mhm.
And I think that
Mhm.
is so important, the way that he empowers his characters by putting so many of them in. Here we're going to get real technical for a second, back to English major class. First and second person, right? You know where I'm going. It's
Mhm.
first and second person, these particular stories. So let me ask y'all this. I mean, and Megan, of course, you know the stories very well, and Maureen, you're a reader too, so you understand what it's like to dwell in different POV, P's OV, in a story, points of view. We've got many of them. Many of the ones in this book are in first person. Okay,
Mhm.
we have an interesting little subset in the second person POV. The story is told from the you perspective. It's kind of a hybrid form, and then the vast minority are actually in the strict third person. And of those, most of them are in what's called free and direct discourse, which is a close third person. So, best metaphor for that is you have the camera is over somebody's shoulder and it kind of rides alongside their shoulder and it actually has access to their thoughts, but it is still telling the story about them. It can kind of dip in and out of the objective scene and their subjective approach to that. So the free indirect discourse is a really popular narrative form because it gives you both access to first and that kind of neutral-ish gaze of third. Okay. What did y'all make of the spread of points of view here? Did that kind of catch you, Megan, as you were reading that you have a range of more or less all of them on offer? There's no strict third that is totally neutral and objective. Maurice, he's not playing that game, but you got kind of everything else going. What was your take on that spread?
I think what it allowed him to do was to really occupy all of these different voices, right? Because so many of the characters speak in a very distinctive way that is unique to that story. So, for instance, in Fast Hands, Fast Feet, the way that she uses sort of the last word, wherein she uses these lines, it's like, I'm going to eat tonight, me, or that's bird shit, that. So that little repetition of a previous word at the end of the sentence, only that character does that in that story, nowhere else in the book. And the one that really struck me, but it didn't strike me until my third read of this book, is Ghetto University, which is my favorite. I love that story.
Is that your jam? Yeah.
That is, I love that story. So the narrator, and I'm not giving anything away, Maureen, is a college professor or a former college professor. And so he's got a PhD in English. He taught Pushkin. And I didn't realize till my third read, which is after it had been chosen as One Book, One New Orleans 2023 selection, and I was developing the curriculum for the book to go into the adult ed programs, right? Because what I do is I take apart all of the stories and I take out all the vocabulary words folks might need to look up if they're working on their reading skills. And for some stories, it was like 2 or 3 words. Even for Before I Let Go, it wasn't that many, even though Before I Let Go is 40 pages and it's the longest story. But in Ghetto University, it was 3 columns, single space, and they took up an entire page.
Oh my gosh.
Right? So the way that he uses that really intense vocabulary, college level, very elevated, coming from a narrator with that background. And he doesn't use that in any other story. I mean, just the way that each character talked in their background, had their own distinct voice. That's, I think, what that POV spread really allowed, was their voices to come through in a way that otherwise they wouldn't have. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Maureen, do you have in maybe some of the books you've read recently or just some old favorites, do you have a novel or a story collection that you love which has like a really powerful and distinctive voice that you kind of keep returning to from time to time? Of course, one of the classics that we all read is Catcher in the Rye, Holden Caulfield, but there's so many to choose from. Do you have a particular favorite?
Not really right now, because now I'm strictly doing nonfiction. So it would be someone who has done well. I just listened to another seminar on cocaine, and there are many people that from BCE time, and it just brought out different characters that I've never heard of before. And the whole process of the idea of the cocaine, it was the character of the talk, and that was interesting. But I really haven't read like I used to, just other things.
No worries. Well, you have this one to look forward to once you start diving in.
Wait, you all have hooked me. You have got me hooked, definitely.
Well,
Can't wait to
you got lots to look forward to.
While I'm reading of what your comments, will help me to enjoy the book more.
Yeah. On character, one thing too that he does, which he gives us the voices and he brings us in such an immediate way. I mean, so many of these stories just start right off, and it is that voice that hooks you in, just one after another. But I thought he does something else too, beyond the level of dialect and language, right? And like his dialects are just he has such a good ear, right, for how people
Mhm.
actually talk. It is mind-blowingly good for capturing
Mhm.
that kind of street level parlance. But I thought something else he did that was really evocative and important was, live in New Orleans long enough, and you will see some colorful characters. And I don't mean the kind of like famous colorful characters that everybody knows about, Ruthie the Duck Girl or Edwin Edwards. I'm talking about like just the folks on your block, who they got a story, or like, the guy who drives the truck, with all the stuff hanging out the sides, and that it's parts from like 8 different manufacturers that are holding that truck together. And he's a junker, he's a scrapper, he's going around picking up anything he can, taking it to the recycle yard. He's got a loop, he's got a circuit. You know the guy I'm talking about. Everybody
Mhm.
sees it in the neighborhood. Everybody has one in the neighborhood. No matter where you live. For me, like Maurice gives such depth of understanding, and empathy is a very good word, to those folks. And I'm thinking kind of like the relationship between, maybe this came up in a previous discussion, Megan, I don't know, but as I look at the Pie Man, right?
Mhm.
Who I was thinking of when I was reading Pie Man is Mr. Okra, right? It's like
Hmm.
the pie man has the van that you see going around with the kind of the faded lettering, and the kind of, he does his thing, he's got his hustle. And the van is never quite fixed,
Mhm.
like it just ain't ever gonna get fixed really. He goes around, he's got his lip, he's got his circuit. Thinking about, I used to live on Mr. Okra's route when I lived on Dumaine Street in Mid City, and every Wednesday morning, there you would come, and yeah, sure, you run out, you buy some stuff if you need some stuff. But I thought one of the things that uh, Maurice really shines at, just one of his talents as a storyteller here, is that there's a version of Mr. Okra that most folks see, and it's an arm's length distance away version.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? It's the kind of Mr. Okra that the hipsters celebrate. I don't know if you went to his second line when Mr. Okra died, but I did, and you could not get anywhere near, because everybody was out with their cameras trying to get as close as possible to the
Mhm.
thing for their Instagram accounts. I mean, come on, right? It was
Mhm.
the hipsters made Mr. Okra's funeral about themselves, not about him.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
And what
Mhm.
Maurice does in these stories, I mean, I went because I've been on his route and bought stuff from him. I wanted to pay my respects. But what Maurice does is, like with the Pie Man or the Roman candy seller, who shows up interestingly in Charisma Price's uh, new collection of poems, which is I'm Always So Serious. Got to give them the shout out because they're birthday twins. But what Maurice does with the Pie Man is he shows you the Pie Man at home, right?
Mhm.
He shows you Mr. Okra at home when Mr. Okra is tired. Cat knocking the book off the table. That's one of her powers. He shows you the Pie Man when the Pie Man is trying to gas up the truck, when he's trying to make a living, when he's trying to teach his son how to do right. And he shows you, these sort of colorful characters that populate your neighborhood and your landscape. But he shows them to you way out of the glare of the cell phone camera, the Instagram filter, all those sort of forms of mediation that you just become avenues for consumption.
Mhm.
He's showing you, Mr. Okra the Pie Man, taking off that sweaty shirt at the end of the day, and just wanting to crawl into bed and get some rest so that he can do it all over again the next day. And there's just such empathy there. You know what I'm getting at? You feel me on
Mhm.
this?
I do. I actually have a question for you because I love that take on the Pie Man. I hadn't thought about that before. Maureen, what strikes me about the Pie Man, what I've always wondered about that story, is the Pie Man's not the main character, even though he's the character the story's named after. It's his son, I think. He's like, the Pie Man's my dad, but not really, you know? That is the main character, and the son's sort of getting into trouble. And the Pie Man's really kind of, a marginal figure in the little boy's narrative. Why do we think it's called the Pie Man, given that he doesn't really play that central role?
Well, the best answer I can give you comes from the story itself,
Okay.
which is that Baby says, a dad ain't something you say, it's something to be proved.
Mm.
I think about that a lot.
Mhm.
Like that line is one of those lines that is so true. That is
Mhm.
so true that when you think about the kind of relationship that's required and the kind of stakes that are present in the relationship, you understand that, as in so many of these stories, when necessity and need are driving the story, that the stakes are on the pie man to raise his son in a way to where, when Baby makes that choice at the end of the story to raise that baseball bat. Now, we don't know what happens when he raises that baseball bat, right?
Mhm.
Maurice ends it right at that moment, but
Mhm.
we know what the stakes are for how Pie Man has tried to raise him up until that point. And it's,
Mhm.
the cost of failure at that point, potential failure, as
Mhm.
well as the rewards of success, are both
Mhm.
so brightly illuminated. I believe that fiction gives you that more clearly than any rule book ever could.
Mhm.
So I think that's why the story is named the Pie Man, is because that's where the locus of the potential, or the potential cost, I think is what I'm trying to say,
Mhm.
is found. Fatherhood is something that is proved, regardless of any
Mhm.
biological connection,
Yeah,
to a child. Does that answer your question? I mean, I don't know. That's
it
just me
sure
shooting from the
does.
hip, but
Yeah.
it's man, that line, that's like the knife goes in and then it's twist, twist, twist,
Mhm.
twist, twist, all
Mhm.
throughout the rest of the story. So,
Oh yeah, those end
let
moments in general. So Maureen, there's this author, local author, Kalamuya Salam, who used to run a writing workshop, and apparently I've heard Jarvis DeBerry quote him from that workshop as saying the two most important pieces of a piece of writing are the last line and the last line.
Uh-huh.
And Maurice nails that in every single story. His last lines, I mean, they will stay with you, they will haunt you. I can probably quote like half the book's last lines
Uh-huh.
off the top of my head because they just live in your head rent free, you know?
yeah.
Well, I have enjoyed this, but I do have to go fix dinner.
Cool.
So, but Benjamin, thank you so very much. I really enjoyed this, and I will. Are you all going to have another meeting on this book? I will participate and make sure that
Well,
I
thank
read
you for
the
joining us.
book because it was incredible. You all are
It's
wonderful.
October 24th, the
Okay.
fourth Tuesday in October, October
Oh,
24th.
okay.
And we'll also have some in-person stuff too, but we've already got the virtual set for October 24th.
Well, thank you very much. And you all have a lovely evening.
You too.
Maureen,
Thank
thank
you.
you for joining us. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
All right, so let's because I think you raise a really good question there. I would love to talk. I know we have to be a little mindful of the time, and we may not even get to our two stories. We're covering all the stories tonight, but I would love to just bat around real quick that exact question you raised. I have a big bold heading in my notes here, which is two under the plot section. So we did setting, we've done character. All right, we're on to plot. And we've talked a little bit about how necessity and need are kind of the driving forces behind many of the stories. But I've just got this like big old neon glowy sign, in the middle of the night here, which is like shining out for all of us, which is, how does Maurice begin a story and how does Maurice end a story? Because there are so many ways to do it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
his first lines and his last lines, or I'm gonna broaden that just a hair. I actually believe not just in the importance of the first line, but really in the importance of like the first scene establishing thought. Okay, so that can
Mm-hmm.
be a short paragraph if need be, but like I'm not so um, dogmatic about, oh, it has to be the first sentence. Some people are. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not.
Mm-hmm.
I try to be a little more relaxed about it. But I've got a list of a couple of um, the incidents here where he begins his stories in a different way. And if we want to talk about first sentences, we should talk about Beg Bar Steal, right? I mean, the
Yes.
first sentence of Beg Bar Steal is, get my book back from the floor. Thank you, Snickers, for your
Mm-hmm.
contribution. Is one of the best first sentences in this story, in this collection of insanely good first sentences, that we've
Mm-hmm.
got. Let's read it. Quote, the first thing Pop do when he get home from Angola is shove you and your little sister out the front door.
Mm-hmm.
Look at everything that is happening in that sentence.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's you have character, you have place, you have action, you have imagery, you have backstory, right?
Mm-hmm.
All in less than 20 words,
Oh
just
yeah.
like right there. It is
Mm-hmm.
magic. It is magic.
I mean, in the last line of
She
that
agrees.
story
She
too, I
agrees.
don't have my book in front of me, but I believe the last line is "You feel something give."
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
that's
Ooh,
exactly what it is.
yeah. I mean, that just like gets you.
Hmm. Yeah, I like the one for the opening clause of Glamour Work, where he
Hmm.
writes, "When I was in juvie probation."
Did
I mean,
you
like,
notice, by the way, that Glamourworks main character is Jean, and so is the main character in Catch What You Can. So there's part of me that wonders if that's little Jean years later, or if that was just a
so
coincidence.
so were Maurice with us? One of the questions, this evening, one of the questions I would have asked him is, because I've identified a couple of little moments like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
the creation and the collections of interlinked stories are increasingly common nowadays. It's not like a new thing, but you always want
Mm-hmm.
to see whether or not someone's trying to pull it off. And I've identified a couple of little overlaps. Okay, so that's one. That's definitely one. Another one is the gray SUV. Okay, that shows up both in the ones who don't say they love you and in Rhinoceros. There's something
Mm-hmm.
about that gray SUV, okay,
Yeah.
with the tinted windows. The other one, which is real subtle, and I'm just dying to ask him, is the restaurant with the lobster tank. So it's in
Mm. That's what you
Catch
can.
What You Can, and in one other story, which I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but there's another restaurant with the lobster tank in there.
Oh, oh, you know what?
Uh-huh.
If I look, I think I have a list of every food every character eats. We
Nice,
can figure
nice.
this out real quick.
There you go. Well, so they don't in the other one, I don't think they eat it. It's just in the background.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, it's just kind of part of the scenery.
Because yeah,
So I'd have to
they're
dig. I'd have to dig for it to find it. But yes, what we are asking effectively is there such a thing as the Maurice Carlos Ruffin extended universe, right, or the multiverse?
yeah, there could be. I'd live in that
I
multiverse.
know, right?
All right, I gotta quit
But
looking for the
yeah,
list of food.
no, sure. I think one of the things that that is important to note here is that he, with these openings, when he begins a story, there is nearly always a sense of urgency, right?
Hmm.
And I, I've heard him say before that one of the things that he tries to do in nearly every story he writes is place his
Hmm.
characters in danger somehow.
Yeah.
Danger is extremely important to him as a storyteller. Physical danger, we're talking.
Hmm.
What's interesting is that even though that is not always present, the element of physical danger in every story in this particular collection. The sense of kind of hitting the ground running, entering that story midstream, something has to happen. The urgency is established everywhere we look. And, you can't really find a beginning that does not have some element of propulsion, buried within it, right? And
Absolutely.
I think that's really cool. One of my other favorite contemporary novelists, also three named, is Michael Ferris Smith.
Hmm.
Huge Michael Ferris Smith fan. He's a Mississippian like myself, and one of his main theories of narrative tension or of storytelling is that every scene from the first page forward has to have some propulsion to it,
Mm.
and it can be literary, but the story has to have a sense of that speed that is constantly, moving forward, dragging you forward. You
Hmm.
don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what predicament the characters are going to get into next or how they're going to get out of it. And, you,
Hmm.
as a storyteller, you always have to be adding that in order to keep things going. And I think Maurice achieves that here, in most of his stories, in the vast majority of these.
And I'm pondering in my brain on your idea of danger because I think that's so incredible. And I hadn't thought about the stories in that way that all of the characters are in danger somehow. I'm thinking really particularly about Token. I don't know why that's the first one that's coming to mind.
Yeah. Oh,
Because
interesting.
that
Yeah.
narrator is not in physical danger at all, but emotional and spiritual danger, which are just as prevalent as physical danger, and in
Yeah.
some ways worse. And so thinking about that as a form of danger and a form of violence when you're sort of constantly being tokenized, that's fascinating to think about.
Yeah. Some of his earlier stories before this came out, I don't remember the title of it, but he's published one which is from the perspective of like a 14-year-old boy in West Africa who is watching, who is like in a small community where slavers come to visit.
Oh wow.
And yeah, I mean, when I say come to visit, I mean it's, they're coming to bind up the men and young boys and put them in shackles and put them on boats and send them across the
Mm-hmm.
Atlantic. And that story is one of these kind of uh, illustrations of, from the very beginning, this character could be facing extreme irrevocable personal harm, and so like at the hands of somebody else or at the hands of as a consequence of their own decisions, and it generates this like, deep unease and fear as a reader, which requires you to keep reading, right? So, really, really powerful, and I think that's been a part of Maurice's toolkit for a long time, by his own admission. So,
Yeah.
so we got beginnings, endings. I think it's important to note that, when we ask how does Maurice end a story, I have found, and I'd be curious what your list includes, but I have found kind of three broad categories for the state of affairs at the end of a Maurice story. Okay. Uh, you know, Ending number one is the characters are in more trouble than they began, right? Which is compelling in its own way. Ghetto University is a good example. Catch What You Can is another good example. So that the level of trouble has risen overall from beginning to end in the story. Uh, Number two, sort of category number two, you end at the moment of the fateful decision, but you don't know what that decision is. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously in that particular case, Pie Man is an excellent example. And
Mm-hmm.
um, maybe you could make the argument about Fast Hands. You could sort of suggest that she's going to stay there for the night, but we don't know what she's going to do the next day. Okay, so it's kind of a protracted
Mm-hmm.
sense of uncertainty there. And then, the third sort of broad category of, ending plot is, he takes us either directly to or just after the precipice of change with all of its emotional and it's like situational baggage, right? So the decision
Mhm.
has been made, and we journey into the aftermath of the decision, but we only journey just a tiny little way, and the
Mhm.
rest is left for us to piece together.
Yeah.
So, like Caesarea is a good example. We know what she's going to do, but we don't know
Mhm.
what the consequences of that are going to be, right? Um, Beg Borrow is another good one because he's gonna steal the car. The kid is gonna steal the
Right.
car, but we don't know like what those consequences will be.
Mhm.
There's so many stories where it's like the decision has been made,
Yeah.
but the ramifications are left completely open. You know.
Absolutely. And the one that I always think about when you talk about that is the places I couldn't go,
Hmm. Oh
where,
yeah,
there's the child that he didn't want, and then he sees the woman at the gas station all those years later with the little boy, and the last line is,
yeah,
"We don't know him."
yeah,
And, that decision had been made, and now he's really sort of left standing there. And we don't know what the ramifications are in his life. She seems to be cool, and so does the kid. But yeah, thinking about
yeah.
where he is and how he's grappling with that is really, really powerful.
It's a hard thing, I think, both in fiction and in life, to reap what you sow.
Yeah.
We always want to reap something else than what we've sown.
Mm-hmm.
And it's when we reach those moments, we have to ask ourselves, is this really what I wanted?
Mm-hmm.
And so often fiction sort of forces that question open in a way that makes us really uncomfortable, but we need to live there. It's funny too, because I think so much of the New Orleans tradition of novel writing or of fiction writing involves protracted speculation, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you look at Confederacy of Dunces, right? You look at the moviegoer, and here you have these protagonists who most of what they do, and I'm just going to be a jerk here. I'm sorry. Like most of what they do is think. They,
Mm-hmm.
they they
Oh
walk
yeah.
around and they ruminate, and it's like this constant, kind of like, I'm going to have some thoughts and then I'm going to tell you about them. And then we might get back to the action here in the next couple of pages, right? You
Mm-hmm.
can't, I mean, like, and Moviegoer is one of my favorite novels of all time. I love Binks Falling, but, he's just a chatterbox, you know what I mean? And it's kind of like, he can't stop reflecting, and it's kind of hilarious because when it comes decision time,
Mm-hmm.
hold up, I got
Mm-hmm.
to think about that some more, and it's so funny because you have the almost like an indictment of that, or like an inverse of that. There was this one really interesting moment. You mentioned places it can't go. I was thinking of the Sparer in the context of like New Orleans novel writing or fiction writing, because what you
Mm-hmm.
have is the exact antithesis of, you remember that scene in the moviegoer when they're walking through the quarter, and Binks sees the movie star, and
Mm-hmm.
and the movie star asks the the young couple, the fiancés, for a light for his cigarette, and that propels. It's this big deal, and Binks said that spawns Binks's whole soliloquy on the certification. He's got his theories of the repetition. Now he has the theory of the certification. A famous person did a thing in these
Mm-hmm.
people's lives, and that moment will always be marked. That moment is now certified because something important happened in that spot on Royal Street. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then therefore, like, Binks is constantly searching for further certifications, is what he calls them, throughout the rest of the book. Well, in The Sparer, here you have the antithesis of that, where the guy that the narrator used to pick on and bully, you know, the
Mm-hmm.
famous boxer with his pretty girl, says, the narrator says, "Oh, we used to spar back in the day," and the boxer says, "No, that never happened."
Right.
And it's like everything that Binks was going for to certify a moment. This
Mm-hmm.
story, this story takes and shreds, and it is such a reversal of New Orleans
Mm-hmm.
fiction writing, and such I felt like a really, because it happens in the French Quarter too, if I remember correctly, and it's like Maurice is like
Mm-hmm.
undoing that tradition, and it's like, ugh,
Mm-hmm.
shivers,
It's
shivers.
also real fun how he plays with the spelling of the title there, right? Because I read it as the Sparrow too, but I'm like, wait, is it the Sparger or the Sparrow, right?
Oh yeah, sure, sure, yeah,
And,
interesting.
just the way that he's constantly just sort of manipulating our expectations about what we've just read, about what we're going to read,
No,
and really playing with what words can do and what literature can do.
yeah, no, it's cool. I love that sense of like dialogue across, both within the book, like the intra between the covers, the
Hmm.
stories are talking to each other, and then they're also talking to, stories beyond the covers as well, and it's very intentional.
Oh
So,
yeah, right on. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, someone
well,
picked up in a book club I was doing that Ghetto University is based on The Giver by O. Henry. And I
no
was like,
way.
what? But it
What?
totally, right? When you think about it, the dude who sells
What?
the watch to get the combs for the
Oh yeah,
hair,
of
and then the
course,
woman with the
absolutely.
hair cuts the
Yeah,
hair to
yeah,
get the
yeah,
chain for the
yeah.
watch. Like, oh my God, it totally
What?
does. Yeah, right?
Yeah. Now I'm gonna have to go back and revisit both of those stories and like
Exactly.
pick
Yeah, I
up on.
hadn't
Oh,
read The
that's
Giver
cool.
since I was in fifth grade, probably, but I think that's what he does so masterfully is,
Nice.
when you're talking about speaking to things beyond the page, stories beyond the pages of the
Mhm.
book as well.
Yeah.
Just putting all those
Is
little
that is that
Easter
the
eggs.
is that the story? It's called The Gift of the Magi.
The Gift of the Magi, yes, sorry, not The Giver.
Uh, yeah.
Different O.
Look,
Henry.
I just went to the Mississippi Book Festival and Lois Lowry was there.
Okay.
So yes, Giver definitely right. Gotcha.
Yeah. Gift of the Magi, that's the one I'm thinking about.
Magi. Gift of the Magi. No, it's a great one. That's a great one.
Hmm.
Well, I think there's so many things that we could say here, and we've talked about nearly every story in the book. I think at this point, I do think that there are some really beautiful parallels. If you look at those big three elements in plot, character, and setting, I think that Beg, Bar, Steal, and Fast Hands, Fast Feet do have some really uncanny parallels, which are
Hmm.
really interesting to kind of look at. You've got the father figure and the young person as
Hmm.
kind of protege. You've got the situations of need and desperation. You've got one of the things I love about Maurice's stories is that they are constantly alternating between trouble and hope,
Yeah.
and you get more trouble, and then you get a little bit of break from that. You get a little bit of relief. You get a little hope, but the hope doesn't last very long. And in
Yeah.
fact, as you noted, most of the hope takes place in the form of food. It's what they
Hmm.
eat. It's the
Hmm.
ribs. It's the sweet cake. I mean, it's the
Hmm.
lobster, right? In Catch
Hmm.
What You Can. And it's
It
like,
tastes like honey,
you know,
yeah.
it tastes like honey. You get the trouble and then the relief. But as soon as that relief is over, it's back to trouble again. And usually
Hmm.
it's an intensified form of trouble. It's a deeper trouble. But he's kind of, there's like a pendulum in his stories, and it's
Hmm.
constantly swinging back and forth between one and the
Yeah.
other. Those two have it in spades.
Yeah.
I actually, and as I was revisiting these stories, I identified like 10 uncanny parallels between those particular
Oh
stories,
yeah,
and we may not have
absolutely.
time to go through all of them now, but like it's
Yeah.
cool to see how the stories talk to each other in different
Yeah,
ways.
and thinking about that, like, trouble and hope, I think that's why it's so important that the last part of the last story, like,
Mhm.
really ends on a moment of consciously choosing joy, right? When Galia
Yeah.
walks outside. I'm almost quoting, if not directly quoting, once again, this is off the top of my head. She'll
Mhm.
be in the crush of bodies among the thousand eyes, reaching for a bell of brass, right? She's
Yeah.
going to go, she's going to choose that moment of joy. She's going to choose to be with her community. And I
Yeah.
love that he ends it on actively choosing joy. I think that's a really powerful way to sort of close this book that is at times incredibly difficult to read.
Yeah, it's got some moments where you're just like,
Yeah.
no, 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 please no. And yet the characters, they push through, they've got that grit, they've got that tenacity, they've got that heart. And, it's just you're rooting for them the whole the whole time. Even that kid with the screwdriver got to hotwire
Yeah.
that car, you know.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, you're really rooting for him to, somehow get some stability,
yeah, yeah, and to do what you know what he has to do, and to provide in the same way that his dad has tried to provide, and to step up and to contribute. And no, it's just such a moving portrait. It's funny when we were at the very beginning, thinking about Lucille Clifton and studying the masters. It's just such a privilege to get to study one of the masters of the short story form, right? Which
Yeah.
is what we have in this particular collection. So I am just so grateful for the opportunity to do that dive, and um, travel through these towns within towns, and go alongside and within their consciousness. And it's just such an incredible collection. I'm very grateful for the chance to spend some time with it, and bat some ideas around. So thanks for letting me do this. This
Thank
is a
you for
joy.
being here, Ben. I'm gonna hit the
uh,
stop on the record button.
yeah